podcast is brought to you by the Association for Coaching, one of the world's leading international professional bodies which is advancing coaching in business and society worldwide. In today's episode, we bring back all 6 hosts from our 2025 podcast series to share their journeys and experience of putting their series together. We dive deep into their experiences, insights, professional and personal growth, as well as the ripple effects from sharing their passions and the expertise of their guests with you and our audience through the podcast. My name is Rob Lawrence. I'm your host for today's episode, and I'm also the podcast producer for the Association for Coaching. And hiding in the background is Maxine Bell, who in many respects has been the mastermind behind the variety of content and the series that we've had on the podcast channel this year. Today, I am joined virtually by 6 fellow coaches: Kate Jenkinson, Claudia Day, Julie Flower, Jen Kidby, Helena Clayton, and Helen O'Grady. And we're going to not only be reflecting on the wonderful content and guests that we've had on the podcast this year, but also their podcasting and hosting experience as coaches and how these series have supported our hosts with their own coaching practice. You're going to hear about the new insights each host has gained from the subjects of their series, which include love in coaching, supervision, leadership, neurodiversity, self-awareness tools, and coaching for good and social impact. I'm hoping you'll enjoy this new format of a Reflections episode as much as I did recording, editing and producing it. You'll hear many new insights and themes evolving as you listen to what my 6 guests have to share with you today. And I'd like to invite you to play a little game and listen, or rather look out for an overarching theme amongst all of our hosts today from 2025. See if you can spot it. To give you a clue, I will share with you a Zen proverb today, which gives a hint to the theme I'm thinking about, and I will be interested to know if you spot it. If you do spot it, you might feel it's glaringly obvious. If you don't, I'd love to know what themes you pick up on from our 2025 Reflections episode. Let me know if you spot the theme and email me at rob@associationforcoaching.com, and I'll share that Zen proverb with you in a short while. So with no further ado, I'd love to introduce to you virtually, as we've recorded these conversations individually and I've brought them together for you collectively in today's special episode. And here are my guests, the hosts from the 2025 episodes, introducing themselves.
My name is Jen Kidby, and my podcast series is called Coaching as a Leader, and it's linked to the book Coaching as a Leader that I edited and co-authored with a group of authors with the AC earlier this year.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. So I'm Kate Jenkinson. I describe myself as a creative executive coach by day and a performance poet by night. And the series I had the privilege and honour to host was called Neurodiversity in the Workplace.
It's really good to be here and to be part of a joined up conversation. So my work, and it has been for 25 plus years, is designing and running leadership development programs, mostly OD, in public and private sector organizations, coaching, coach supervision. And relevant to this conversation, for the last, 7 or 8 years, I've been also exploring, researching, running workshops on love in leadership, in organizational life, and increasingly beyond that. So in particular, there are 2 workshops. One is always free on each month, called Acts of Love for Tough Times, where we look at love as a form of medicine for these really tricky times we're in. And I'm fresh out, actually, about 10 days out of running the November 2025 Love Lab. And my series with you was called Love in Coaching. So it was a chance to talk to 6 people in depth, 6 coaches, 6 extraordinary people, about how they see love's place in their coaching practice.
So my name is Claudia Day. I am a coach, an executive coach, and my series is Self-Awareness, Insight Tools for Growth.
And last but by no means least, I had a conversation with Helen O'Grady on coaching supervision. So I had Helen with me and we got straight into today's conversation when I asked her about the experience of actually putting the podcast together.
Thanks so much, Rob. It's lovely to be here. Lovely to be back in this space, actually. It's been one of the highlights of the year. It's been a big year for me professionally, and pulling this together and recording it was incredibly rewarding. There was a lot of, which I'm sure many people can relate to, imposter syndrome of like, what am I doing? Who am I? I loved it. I found it much more natural than I was expecting. And there was kind of that realization that it's just like coaching and just like supervision. It's about conversations. It's about listening to people. It's about asking questions that hopefully other people might have wanted to ask if they'd had. I was so lucky to have such a broad range of such interesting perspectives around coaching supervision. So yeah, it's been a really, really positive experience, and I feel very blessed to have been given the opportunity.
Helen O'Grady there, reminding me that one of the benefits coaches can bring to podcasts as hosts is their ability to play to their coaching strengths by holding space for their guests and asking great questions. Not that this is always easy, as you'll hear later in this episode, with Helen acknowledging the sensation I believe we all feel as coaches hosting podcasts, that imposter syndrome feeling of, who am I to be doing this? Here's Julie Flower sharing her experience of putting her podcast series together.
Once it was done, I was like, yes, that was like really, I just enjoyed the richness of the conversation so much, and learned so much through having those. So it was a very enriching experience. But in terms of kind of building up to it, there was naturally quite a lot of work, just trying to identify potential schemes and to do a lot of the pre-work, and perhaps more pre-work than one might do with a normal podcast, if you like, that perhaps just has one interviewee. And particularly because I was keen to involve those who had been clients of the projects. For some of them, we needed to protect their identity. We needed to consider other safety and sort of wellbeing concerns to ensure that everybody was comfortable in terms of what we were covering and what we were sharing. So there was more kind of pre-contracting and pre-work to do. But I think in that sense, it really paid off because we built that trust and that relationship and could have really open and interesting conversations. I'd originally, and you know this, Rob, had these sort of highfalutin ideas that it would be like a Radio 4 thing where I'd be, out on site, crunching through the snow or whatever, doing an outside broadcast. In the end, kind of time constraints, people's availability, and just, the sheer kind of technical considerations meant that wasn't possible. And also doing things remotely enabled me to cover a wider geography. So again, that was important, I think, in reflecting the diversity of the schemes. Actually, the fact that I'm based in the southeast, but we could have projects from Devon or from the northeast, etc. So that was beneficial. But yeah, I was pretty busy in December and January trying to work up to everything. But I definitely felt it was an enriching experience.
So that was my huge learning experience. Was, first of all, it was joyful because the conversations were with people that I've either had a connection with because I've worked with them, or I know them, or I've networked with them, or I have admired them from afar. So I got to have brilliant conversations with brilliant people. And as a host, to choose how to kind of theme them and flow the conversations, I really enjoyed that. It was like, I can get people from inside the workplace, outside, people who've kind of lived experience of aspects and processes that I've not had direct involvement in. So I really, really enjoyed being a host, and I learned an awful lot about the process from you and Maxine, and how I'd rather be the person speaking than doing all the tech, frankly.
Well, when you and I first started talking about the possibility of this series, I mean, obviously it got a big yes from me straight away. And then I was next daunted because the logistics of pulling this together, I thought, well, look, I know I can kind of create the vision for it, but the logistics, I'm not wired that way. And it transpired that you and Maxine and the Association for Coaching were phenomenal in really helping me with the infrastructure, with contacting people, with getting the logistics sorted out. So it was easy, I think. That's the first thing. It was you and Maxine made it really easy to do, which is a huge thing. And it was then lovely to think about, who is really able to speak with depth and confidence and expansiveness about love in coaching? And how could I bring together 6 people to represent a broad range of perspectives? So that was really juicy, thinking about who that might be. And of the 6 people I contacted, all 6 said a big yes. So again, there's something about there being really an appetite now to talk very openly and explicitly and without any awkwardness about love.
It was so easy because the authors for this book have been so fabulous and so giving. We had more authors come forward who wanted to be a part of it than at the time we had capacity to include within podcasts. So I didn't have to persuade at all. I think I sent a WhatsApp message and within a day, I had 6 or 7 people saying, yes, please, if I can, that would be amazing. So that was great. And then the actual recording, I think I probably mentioned at the time, it was the first time I'd hosted a podcast series like this. So for me, it was a brand new experience. And I think going into it, I'd created a lot of kind of structure and questions. And then once I started, the conversation just flowed so naturally. And the guest was so fabulous and passionate that the time just slipped by. So I think for anyone who's considering being a podcast host, to know that actually, if you get someone who's passionate about what they're talking about, it's so much fun and it's so easy. I think what's really been interesting and enjoyable for me is the collaborative nature of it. Because the podcast series is very much based on the book and engaged with authors from the book, and was supported by the Association for Coaching, I really appreciated the collaboration. I mean, it got complex at times, but the collaboration and knowing that everybody had the same purpose, which was to really emphasize the impact of taking coaching skills into your role as a leader, into those everyday moments when you have a conversation with somebody or when you are in a meeting, or just the little kind of on the go everyday moments. So it was really rewarding for me to have the podcast series support the book in that way. I love bringing a global team together. The podcast guests were spanning the continents of the world. So as well as some time zone challenges, which we got through, thankfully, it was wonderful to bring different voices together and to hear that across different organizations, you think about leadership and bringing coaching into leadership and organizations, many of the dynamics are really similar. So that was enjoyable to get a touch of. And just to continue, for me, coaching is at its most impactful when people experience it all the time, because it's role modeling how to be and how to show up. And if an organization can have leaders do that, then I see the impact of that. So very, very rewarding. I'm very grateful for all the collaboration as well.
I absolutely loved it. This one, so I've done with you guys already some, and I think the first one I did was on tech and innovation, and it was at a time where everyone was scared about the technology, and so we used the podcast as a way to broadcast or remove that fear and try and broadcast information about it. The second podcast I did was about the tools and the approaches. And of course, that's very close to my heart and I'm very passionate about that. So I love that side of it. And this third one, it was learning and development in some way, as in using it as a platform to learn something new. So I studied in Henley and we learned psychometrics was part of the course. And then I went on to become a coach and I never used them. I never introduced them in my practice. Then I went into what do I do now with the psychometrics? I left them behind. Do I want to actually look into them? Do I want to use some in my practice? And if I do, well, then which one? And starting to explore that was quite a challenge because there are so many of them out there. And so I think this podcast was an opportunity to explore the psychometrics together with the community, so to say.
That was what was so lovely. There was such a variety of expertise, and everybody I was lucky enough to get to come on, they are the experts in whatever they were talking about. And that didn't feel that uncomfortable because that does sit very much, particularly with coaching. In supervision, there's a little bit more of an expectation that I kind of know what I'm talking about. In coaching, I deliberately take myself out of that expert role and try, and even though our clients often put us into that, I try and remove that. So once I kind of could see the parallels between what I do as a coach, what I do as a supervisor, and then what I was doing as a podcast host, suddenly that kind of helped, I guess, me be comfortable in who I was and just do it my way and see what happened.
Some insightful reflections here, including Julie, Jen and Kate emphasising the sentiments of the other hosts, expressing their gratitude for how joyful and enriching the experience has been, with myself and Maxine and the AC Digital Learning team handling the tech and logistics of organising guests and recordings all the way through to production and publication, so that they could concentrate on being hosts and holding conversations. Many of those conversations I felt were not only important, but groundbreaking conversations. I was also inspired to hear Jen talk about bringing different voices together from around the globe, one of the benefits of recording a podcast remotely with modern tech these days. I was also inspired by Claudia's reflections on how creating the podcast was a useful way to not only learn, but to share those learnings and insights with you and an audience. Claudia also mentioned how the podcast has been a way to broadcast and remove the fear about new themes emerging in the world of coaching, such as tech, and as you'll hear in 2026, I'm sure more of, AI. And then Helen there emphasising how the podcast has been an opportunity to provide another platform for expert coaches to communicate. Even though I was part of the recording, editing and production process along with Maxine, it was really interesting for me to hear each individual host what their experience was of putting their own podcast series together, which brought to my mind the question of how they may have grown as a coach through this experience. So you're going to hear from each of the hosts again now, starting with Julie, how this experience has helped them to grow as a coach.
Being honest with myself, I think there's still work for me to do around how I might step into the space of being a coach in some scenarios that perhaps, I have to admit, would challenge me. You know, if I really put myself in the position of perhaps working with particular client groups. And as I say, examples such as carers, or there are examples of those in the criminal justice system, or those who had survived domestic abuse. I suppose I hopefully have gained, dare I say, a certain amount more empathy around people's different situations and what they bring both as clients and as coaches. But also I have to admit that it made me very proud that coaching could do this, because I think sometimes coaching gets a reputation of being very corporate, perhaps, dare I say, quite money driven, whereas actually this really very person-centered, very human work, which also was very, very practical, incredibly practical for many of the people who took part in this. Yeah, so it's taught me a lot, but I think there's still further to go, because I'm still thinking through how I might personally get more involved in coaching for good. And still, I would say that I'm at that place where I'm coaching those involved in, say, managing charities and leading charities, for instance, rather than actually doing work with different client groups. I think that's a stretch for me.
I think every time I have a conversation about neurodiversity, it has to grow me as a coach, because I learn something about the human experience that I didn't maybe appreciate before. And because I work with leaders and the corporate world, and I help people develop their career mostly in the workplace, then absolutely finding out what is happening for leaders currently, or what's happening in the employment law space or recruitment, there's something that's really important that everybody shared that I need to understand. So I can't pick one thing that I would say was the aha moment, because it all had relevance to what I do. I think I'm quite an experience seeker, let's just say that. So I love to put myself in different situations and experience them. So I've worked inside and outside organisations. But to have, say, for example, Ellie talk about the employment law aspect and Mark talk about the recruitment, I've never been in their shoes. So each of them shared something that was unique to their experience and of value to me as a coach, and to, I'm sure, listeners who either came from a coaching or a workplace leadership background.
It absolutely has been a piece of personal and professional development for me as a coach, listening to other coaches, just talking about what they do, why, how. And coaching is, clearly most coaches will be in supervision, but not always or often group supervision. So it's not often you get to really talk to other coaches about what they do. So hearing 6 other people talk about their coaching practice and how love shows up has really held up a mirror to me and my coaching. So one of the episodes is with a guy called Craig White, and his coaching, even if you take love out of it, is so far removed from a 1-hour session via Zoom that it is possible to be. So that has really got me thinking about my own offering as a coach, and talking to Marie Quigley, for example, about really being very, very upfront about using the word love explicitly as a core part of her coaching philosophy. That came up in conversation with at least a couple of others as well. Again, has invited me to think about how I might have more courage, be more bold about using the word love and putting it front and centre in my work. So it's also making me think about, would I, for example, start up a book group looking at books to do with love? I have a whole library of them, and I wonder what it would be like to just convene groups of people around wider, broader conversations about love in their life and organisations. So I don't really know the extent of the impact of this series on me, but I think it would be quite profound. It would be very creative and generative for me personally, and I was not expecting there to be so many gifts for me personally and professionally.
It's reinforced for me the impact of multiple perspectives. And the coach, I think it's a given. There is no one version of reality, even more so in today's world. And the value and the richness of multiple perspectives, I think that's the thing that's really been reinforced for me in my coaching practice. And also a little bit of reinforcement that what I'm practicing as a coach is also being practiced elsewhere within organizations. So a sense of connection, really.
I don't know if it's that it's grown me or it's just cemented further a knowledge that I had already received from my tuition. But it was that concept of really understanding the situation you're working with before actually choosing a tool. And just so I could say at the start of an engagement, we're going to do all these psychometrics, and that's my approach. Whereas this went more through what might this person need that I have available in my tools, and then choose that. So targeting more to what the client actually needs. And so still, even now, it's not that we have an engagement and necessarily everyone will go. Not all my coachees have done the tool. So it's still on a case-to-case basis. Does this tool make sense? So you could say, yeah, the topic of well-being is an important topic, but it doesn't mean that me as a coach, I'm going to impose that topic on all my coachees. So it's in some way, the process itself helped me to reflect what makes sense based on the clients I have had until now, rather than just trying to. And even though I like many of the tools, it doesn't mean I want to. And I have been actually thinking, what makes sense next? Is there another tool actually that I would like to have? This is where I wish the podcast was longer and I could have done more tools, because I've come across emotional intelligence as well. That one is one that for people in leadership can be actually quite helpful. And so it's not that everybody would do it, but it's nice as a coach to have that at my disposal to then go and be able to apply it if necessary.
Yeah, when it was first suggested to me, and Maxine very kindly suggested after I'd been a guest on one of the other AC, the Day in the Life, that I might want to do it. And I kind of put the phone down and thought, oh, I'll have a think about that. And then was like, this is my year of saying yes and trying to do things that I don't normally do. And then it was like, now I actually have to find people who are willing to join me. And then, this incredible list of supervisors, many of whom I really look up to, kind of saying yes, I guess that fed into my imposter syndrome of what right have I got to ask them questions, and I can't believe they're showing up. And I've never been a podcaster. So there was that felt like conscious incompetence of I don't know how to do this well. Don't really know what good looks like, I suppose. That was the other thing. Whereas in other areas, that I've become skilled at, I had a sense of what good looked like. Whereas this, I didn't really. But in some ways, I think that was helpful, of just trusting myself and going, okay, we'll do it your way and it'll either work or not. And what's the worst thing that can happen? Hopefully I'm not going to do any damage to the brand of the AC. I'm sure they will, you and Maxine protected me from that. But just going, well, just see what happens. And so, yeah, I just really enjoyed it and learned, I guess, about myself around you can do things which I knew, but I guess I hadn't done for a little while, of doing things that were uncomfortable and I wasn't sure about what the outcome was going to be.
You can't create a series and have deep conversations with experts and not learn more about your subject matter as a coach. So I was curious to learn more about what each host had to say in terms of new insights and being essentially at the cutting edge of each of their own chosen topics. Here's Claudia.
Something that stood out was how the experience of actually going through so many of them. Because in order to do every episode, I also did the psychometric myself and then had a session with whoever was the speaker to have a debrief on it. And in some way, I enjoyed individually having, each psychometric individually, but also the conglomerate of them. So almost like I'm in my 40s, they say in your 40s, you go through a life transition. I was also going through a transition moving to Norway. And in some way, going through this process of having all these tools at my disposal was actually quite helpful to gain more awareness about myself and what I wanted to change. And so that was super helpful. And I think I also gained insight into which one to introduce into my practice and what made sense. So at the start of it, I would say I had no idea what made sense. And at the end of it, I had a better idea of what I should do in terms of my own practice. So it was quite helpful as well on that side.
So I think there was, for me, something about the sheer diversity of different schemes in operation. And I mean, we only touched the surface. I was really keen that in each episode, we had kind of a deep dive into one particular scheme. So ideally talking to both those who are delivering it as coaches and as those kind of managing and organising it, but also through clients and getting their perspectives as well. But even just the diversity in the 6 case studies that we had was immense in terms of the variety of applications of coaching, whether it be, for instance, in prisons or with respect to unpaid carers, or, fascinating scheme where people who have learning disability or live with autism actually learn coaching skills to coach commissioners of those services. So really fascinating applications. Yeah, what I learned was actually just the sheer breadth of use of coaching. And then also I learned a lot about integration. So thinking about how we can integrate our own skills, our strengths, different aspects of who we are to enrich coaching. So one example was with respect to a scheme which integrated coaching for grief, bereavement coaching, and non-contact boxing. So for me, this just gave a sense of the real endless possibilities of this work.
I think what was really interesting was every episode there were hints and tips that surprised me that each guest shared, from simplest things like leaders leaning into their kindness to how tech can really hinder or help a neurodivergent person in the workplace, and I just got something from every single episode.
If I think about the podcast episodes and the book, right, because the two are intertwined, wow, this is a really hard question because there's so much from every one of the guests. I'll go with the first thing that popped into my head, which was around language. So one of the episodes was with Tony Wargam and was around how words make worlds and looking at the power of everyday language, the words that we use, which is something I've been passionate about for many, many years. The way that Tony explored it coming from a transactional analysis perspective, it kind of connected some dots for me around what I know from neurolinguistic programming and my background as a psychologist, and then layering on transactional analysis and thinking about what do I see every day that leaders show on the surface structure of their language. That's something that I've continued to muse on this year.
We've just finished recording, right? So it's still very fresh with me. So I think that is still growing. But one of the things that has really struck me is that the attitude, acceptance of the word love in organisational life has changed enormously. So when I began this work in 2017 and I started to talk to people about, I'm going to start researching, writing about love in organisations. Some wanted a face plant. Others said, you don't mean love, do you? You won't actually use the word love. No, I actually will. That really has changed. I think post-COVID, partly to do with the very fragmented, tricky times we're in, I think there is much, much more curiosity and active interest in the place love has. So that was very affirming, very validating, I would say that. But that has surprised me, actually, the level of interest in it now.
I learned something from everybody. And as you say, we are peers and I have a lot of respect, and some of them I knew beforehand, some I didn't. I think the ones that really have continued and I'm continuing to kind of think about and develop, particularly Neil's episode around kind of liminal space and darkness and the unknowing. Like I was aware of that, but it really pushed me into, you need to keep going into that discomfort, that there is a danger as a coach and a coach supervisor when you've been doing it for a while that you get comfortable. And actually that's not a helpful space to be, either for me or more importantly for my clients. So really thinking about, how do I keep myself in the discomfort? How do I normalize that for clients? How do I, in supervision, share that it's okay that neither of us know that we're going? So that, I think, I was aware of, but it's brought it much more to my attention, I suppose. Two other ones, one around neurodivergence, which again is a hot topic both in coaching and coach supervision and in the wider world, obviously, that people are talking about it. And I think it's really critical that I think about it. And so I've been thinking about, how do I make my spaces more inclusive? How am I more open and honest about that? So that has been helpful. And then the third one is around power. And again, with Shruti and the round table, really thinking about, how do I accept that it's there, hold it lightly, name it, reduce the impact, support coaches to think about power in their relationships as well. So again, it was something I was aware of, but I just feel like I've got a heightened awareness. But I really learned something from everybody, which sounds a bit trite, but it's true.
There's so many insights there from each of our hosts that I would have to encourage you to go back and listen to any of those series that appeal to you in terms of their themes and topics, for you to go much deeper to gain your own insights as to what our hosts are kindly sharing with us today. With these new insights, it reminds me of a famous Zen proverb, which is, no man steps into the same river twice. And I'm thinking of all of our different hosts on the podcast series this year and what they've gained both professionally and personally through the experience of putting their own podcast series together, one that goes deep into the subject matters that they're interested in. So with all of that in mind, and accepting the fact that you can't put a podcast series together as a coach and not come through it as a changed person, I asked each of our individual hosts what they had learned about themselves through the process.
I think what's been really nice, which I hadn't anticipated, is I have received some lovely feedback from people listening to them, and saying that they experienced me as somebody who was a relaxed host and that it came across to them as natural. And so that was really lovely. So I guess that's what I've learned about myself, is maybe I can host podcasts and host them well. So that was really nice, and I feel I'm probably blushing. I'm like, oh, that seems like a really weird thing to say, but it's really nice, actually.
This is a hard question, actually. I will be totally transparent. I thought, what have I learned about myself? And I think for me, I thought about it in its entirety. So the podcast series and editing and co-authoring and the Coaching as a Leader book, I think knowing when to let go and when to hold a firm boundary, which for me has been a lifelong endeavor and continues to be a lifelong endeavor. I was sat in the chair that I'm sat in now when I planned the book and thought about the podcast series. So it kind of came from the heart for me, and then to let it go and to let it run wherever it needed to bring the brilliance of other people out. It did require me to let go of something that had been so personal in its origins. And then also knowing when to step back in again so that what we created was a coherent whole rather than a series of bits and a series of separate episodes. So that's one of the things that fed into my ongoing life learning around when to step in, when to step back, when to hold a boundary, and when it's okay if it gets a little bit grey.
So I've learned, I probably knew this about myself, but I learned that I sometimes have very big picture, grandiose ideas, but actually delivering them and like following through and just doing that practicality of delivering, I have to sometimes manage my own and others' expectations. So that was a good example. And, there were points at which I thought, gosh, actually, should I extend the deadline to therefore, be able to do more? But actually just having to do it within certain constraints actually was really good for me. Hopefully that my natural curiosity can bring out the best in people. So I was surprised that some of these projects hadn't had a wider platform before because they were just doing excellent work. And I think there's something about being called annoyingly cheerful, but I do have a certain infectious enthusiasm. And, I just really wanted to even play a very small part in appreciating these schemes and their impact and broadening the number of people who know about them and know about their impact, which of course could benefit not only the coaching community and potential clients in the future, but also obviously other organisations, maybe other charities who want to do similar schemes, or potentially influence funders, because this is costly work, even if volunteers are delivering coaching, which isn't always the case and shouldn't always be the case. So actually just really trying to raise the profile. And that's important to me, that good work, impactful work, is recognised and, finds a way to be funded in whatever way.
I love meeting new people. I kind of knew that anyway, but I also love hearing people talk about things they're passionate about. And each of the guests brought that into the podcast series. So each of them brought a real passion and the energy. I just really enjoyed the energy that we shared, and it came about manifested in wonderful conversations. So it's not new, but I'm reminded that that's something I really enjoy.
I think one of the things I've learned is that I like things broken down. And so that's one of the appealing things from this topic. It's that it basically breaks down concepts. So for example, when I said well-being, it breaks down well-being into 5 components that we can then think about them separately, and those in themselves are then broken down into things that science has proven that help those components. And so even the knowledge that you get from that, just as a practitioner, understanding that doesn't mean, even if you don't use the tool, you already understand well-being better. With emotional intelligence, there is something similar that I found. So for example, optimism. we can have, they divide it in 3 things. So opportunity sensing, positive mood, and resilience. And so you might think, well, I am someone optimistic, but what is happening that I'm sometimes actually not in the right mood? And so when I did an exploration myself, I realized that I don't spend enough time in opportunity sensing. And so maybe I take up too many opportunities. And so then it's difficult to keep the positive mood and the resilience if you're not sure that this is actually the path you're supposed to be taking. And so now I spend more time in the opportunity sensing and looking at and so I think I discovered that I like things broken down, and that's something that I did. In terms of myself in doing the actual podcast, I love working with a team. I loved in some way the experience of working with you and Maxine and having coaching in some way on speaking slower. And I even think I'm speaking fast now. Maybe I'm out of practice, but it's something that I keep every day. I apply it now to meetings. I apply it to so many things where I just speak slower. And the way I speak has been influenced, I think, by the podcast and by the coaching that I got in the episodes that we had and the feedback that I used to get after, And so it's nice to do something where you have that team helping you come up with a concept. Then you have that team feeling when you go into, when we used to go to record, first seeing you having that time and Maxine and having that time before, and then having the feedback afterwards. Even if in some cases it wasn't a positive feedback, it was something to grow on. And I think that experience is also a very nice experience to go through. As coaches, we have very individual lives in some way. Our career is lonely, if you want to say it in some way. So it was great to have that team work in this side, experience it in this side, and bring that into life.
One of the things I find most exciting about podcasts and coaching is the ripple effect they can have. I'm hoping that these series, and indeed this Reflections episode, will create a ripple effect, which one day I may get a glimpse or a hint of. The exciting thing about putting a podcast out into the world is it's going to be doing good, but you don't always know what the impact will be. And if you're lucky, you may just hear something, see something, or indeed feel something, and then get a sense that, yes, this podcast conversation has resonated with somebody. So coming back to the subjects of each series, I was curious to learn about the ripple effect for each of our hosts, having produced and published their series, and had they picked up on any sense of the impact that their series may have had.
So what I think is really important about the podcast series that we created was that it lifts the marginalised voices and experiences in our workplace. And I know that people have gone back and listened to the series when we've mentioned it, and the experience that people shared, I know it's going to have encouraged people to talk about this maybe with different language in the workplace. So my hope is that people go back to it and listen to all of the episodes, really, because there's something they can learn from everyone. And the voices of neurodivergent people in the workplace are often not heard loudly enough or understood. And I'm sure there'll be ripples that people will listen to the series and go, oh, I didn't realise that, or I never thought of it like that. And I just hope that we can create more understanding and acceptance for the fact that we're all different.
Well, the first thing that strikes me when you say that is that even between the people I talked to, the guests on the podcast series, things are happening. So Marie Quigley was my first conversation. That was first released. And then Claire Norman was the second conversation. And you'll see this on LinkedIn. Claire listened to Marie's podcast episode, and she added to LinkedIn in one of the comments that as a result of listening to Marie's podcast episode, she had changed the way she talked about love in her chemistry calls. That meant that it ended up in a very different place, and the people she had talked to much more explicitly about love all said a big yes to working with Claire on the back of that conversation. So I'm loving the fact that things are also happening between the participants. Also, I've mentioned already the episode with Craig White, but when I was running the Love Lab a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about the fact that men were less likely to sign up to a workshop with love in the title. I talked to them about Craig's work, and as a result, they're now connected on LinkedIn. And two of the men who were at the Love Lab were thinking about how they might take the Love Lab and run it for men. So there's something about the threads of connection that are being built between the people that I spoke to, but also lots and lots of smaller threads of community and connection and activity. We've only released the first 3 so far, so that excites me.
It's the small moments. People that I work with say, oh, I listened to that podcast with Katie and Ross, or with Tony, or with Linda, and I really noticed this point. And they would just say it unprompted, and then messages through LinkedIn. Hey, just wanted to let you know, I listened to this episode and this piece really stood out. Every time that happens, it reminds me that there is this podcast series out there in the world that people continue to listen to. And it shows me how the ripples and in my work, I often talk about tentacles and how so much of what we do has tentacles, and sometimes we don't even know. We certainly don't know in the moment. We might find out in the future. And that has been a fascinating experience to hear that from many strangers as well as some of my colleagues.
We don't do it in front of an audience, so we don't get that feedback while we're doing the episode. And I think that's also part of what I like. I almost forget that it is for an audience, and I engage with the person, and then it's just the benefit and hope that they receive the benefit that you're wanting. So whatever, in this case, in this series, it was learning these new psychometrics and seeing which one I apply in my practice, or if I want to apply them or not. In the previous one, it was talking more about something that I was passionate about. And then in the first one, that was just trying to reduce that fear. So you're hoping that effect. The extent of the feedback goes usually to meeting someone and them saying, you don't know me, but I know you because I feel I know you because I've been hearing to your podcast. And so I think or I had a friend who started studying coaching and suddenly sent me the podcast episode I had done with Rob Wilson. And she was like, hey, look at you. Or like, I didn't know that you had done this. And so then she was using the one on the approaches for her own learning. That I'm a bit shy. So that also has its other side where it's like, but I guess that's where I get the feedback in some way, if it's useful. A side of me has always wanted to be a teacher. And so there's a side of me that would love to go back to that. There's something about being able to teach. And I do hope that through the podcast, people learn things that they didn't know before.
And I talk to coaches around that in supervision, that it's the same with coaching, isn't it? That we're desperate to link outcomes, and the ripple effect is often completely unexpected and almost impossible to notice because it's significant, but it's so removed away from us. So I have had some really nice feedback and contact with coaches who have connected with me saying, I found out about you. I listened to you on the podcast. For me, the ripple effect is also about, I guess, my own practice, which I sort of answered earlier, but how complex supervision is. Like, I feel like I just scratched the surface and I could do another, we kind of pushed the boat out and went to 11 episodes. Now it's like, I could do another 10 with different aspects of it. And I think that's what's really nice it's like anything. It's like unpeeling the layers, that's almost the ripple effect of actually there's layer upon layer upon layer. And what is true, and I think that's Joe Birch is a really good example of that. Anne Marie and some of the people, Michelle Lucas, who have been involved in supervision for a long time and maybe involved in podcasts. But what they're talking about now is different from maybe what they were talking about 5 years ago, even though the topic might be exactly the same. And I think that's the ripple effect of building the conversation. And as you said, there are some, but there's not a huge amount of podcasts around coaching supervision. But that ripple effect, I think, is continuing. And I'm excited to see what happens as more and more people think about supervision and how important it is if we're going to call ourselves professional coaches.
So, I mean, certainly anecdotally, I've had a number of conversations with people who are like, oh, listen to that. I found this particular scheme very inspiring, or I hadn't thought about how coaching could be used in that scenario. So it's made people curious about how they might use their skills in different ways. Again, anecdotally, I know that a number of those who were taking part in the podcasts saw the recording as further evidence. At some point they would be either being recommissioned or going to funders, and actually this helps to build the evidence base that they've got. I hope that those will be ripple effects as well. One of the criteria, if you like, for selecting different schemes to come on the podcast was around the fact that they had put some effort into evaluation and demonstrating impact. I know it's hard to demonstrate impact, but I think it's very important within coaching. And so, the fact that they were able to bring that onto the podcast and then potentially use the podcast as evidence of what they're doing and to give them a wider platform, I hope will have further ramifications.
Some really interesting insights there from each of our individual hosts. Kate suggesting that the platform provides a voice for the marginalised, and Julie suggesting that the podcast provides a platform for coaches and those coaching schemes that are having an impact. It was also interesting to hear what Helena had to say about conversations happening between the podcast episodes. During this particular aspect of the reflective conversations I was having with each of the hosts, Claudia offered me an additional insight, not just as a host, but as a listener too.
And I think the other side is, of course, listening to others' podcasts. When I see all the work that your guys are doing and I hear about the plans for next year, it's so exciting, exciting to see these new topics. And I think that in some way also is feedback that we need to keep doing this in order for the knowledge base about coaching to grow and to bring unique voices and to bring that to the rest of the coaching community. For example, the Coaching for Good podcast, I think that was a very original type podcast that you wouldn't necessarily expect to find there. And I enjoyed so much listening to it. Or neurodiversity is such an important topic. And so to hear dive in and be able to actually access all of this and hear all these perspectives. I think what I wish for was more time so that I could actually hear them all. Or I think making the discipline to, on Mondays when you guys release them, to actually put, that's my lunch partner on Mondays, and almost like to book that. But I guess that also the excitement that I get from hearing others also makes me hope that there is excitement in hearing the topics I'm bringing.
As I begin to wrap up our Reflections episode for 2025, building on the insights from all of the podcast episodes we've released to date, which is over 270 episodes now, I was curious to learn from each of the hosts what sticks out in their mind since having made their series. What still stands out in their mind today? Or rather, what will they always remember their own series for? What new insight have they gained that they will always attribute to this series that they were the host of?
How passionate every single person was who came on. And, I feel very blessed for so many supervisors to join me and, as said, experts in their own field. But we met as peers of just sharing. And what stands out for me is how vital coach supervision is. And we almost get a bit blinded. I sort of forget that there's coaches out there who, for whatever reason, struggle to access supervision or keep thinking, oh, I'm not quite ready yet, or it's really hard. It's a financial outlay. It's a time outlay. But I think that's what stood out for me, that this really matters. It makes a difference. It improves the quality of coaching. It protects coaches. It protects our clients. It's super important. And that's what it has reinforced. I knew that beforehand, but it just, those layers and layers has really reinforced, and I'm really grateful for that.
Honestly, really, there's lots and lots. Each conversation was very different. So I suppose that stands out in itself, just that richness and perhaps the unexpected elements of those conversations. There was one moment when we were doing the podcast with Charmaine Pollard, which was around coaching in the field of domestic abuse. And we had 2 survivors of domestic abuse who joined us anonymously on the podcast. And one of them was just talking about some of the impact that the coaching had made to their life. And she mentioned like how important it was to her to create her own space for her and her family. And she talked about what a milestone it was to kind of install this new fireplace. And the new fireplace was visible behind her. I mean, we only did an audio of that particular production, but in the audio, I mentioned it was visible behind her. And it was just that sometimes they might seem like small things, but they are big shifts. And similarly, in the podcast around carers, there were a couple of really interesting examples given. One of a man who had gone on record saying that actually as a result of this coaching for unpaid carers, he'd then gone on and done this research post and, this very quite high profile kind of university post, this new job, which was something that he'd really got out of it. But then there was somebody else who'd also had excellent outcomes from the carers coaching, but actually for them, their shift was just being able to travel to visit their loved one in a different mindset and to notice different things en route and to take some time for themselves. And these are both equally valid and impactful outcomes from this kind of work. So I suppose a long way of answering your question is just the very human-centered and personalized approach that these coaching schemes had, if you like, the impact that they had.
So the emotional roller coaster of it all, really, from sort of quite excited because I'm a very much an emotional experience seeker, like I've said, and I remember being excited at the sort of start of it and a bit nervous, and also being nervous at the end of it as well when I was speaking to people in my network who I hadn't really spoken to before. But I just really enjoyed it when in each of the podcasts there was a moment where I think we both, whoever it was as a guest, resonated with something, an experience we'd both had, and there was a point of common understanding and appreciation. And that was the thing that I took from the whole series, was that human connection and how conversation is so important. And it can be scary sometimes if somebody says something and you don't always agree or understand the language that they're using or why they've said that. But, curiosity is such a powerful connector. I just really enjoyed the emotional experience it was to be the host for that podcast series.
Something that came up really strongly was the power of being really clear and bold about putting love explicitly front and centre at the heart of your coaching work, and how that is really compelling for many people. Another came up through the conversations with Abudi, with Ian, so Abudi Sharbi, Ian Mitchell and Amy Fox, which was how we are seeking greater meaning and purpose in a very complex, difficult, if not chaotic world. And how that includes perhaps more of an exploration, even unknowingly, towards things that might feel more spiritual, and how love is part of that. So a big theme I think that came up is how conversations about love, working with love, might be some of the most important conversations we can have right now.
They all seemed great. And I enjoyed them all. And I was, before coming to the chat today, I was trying to remind myself, like, all the ones I had covered. But there was something about which one do I need for my practice now, which might be different, in some years. But at the moment, when I started my practice, I was focusing a lot on moms returning to work after maternity. And this year, I retook some of that work on more detail. I've also gone to coach leaders in executive positions. And so then it was what makes sense for those types of coachees. And of course, for moms returning to work, well-being is a key concept that you want to work through your sessions. And it might not be the central topic, but it's something that it's nice to accompany. And so by using the well-being tool, it meant that we had something, a common language, something that was broken down into a simpler concept. And then we could check in every throughout the engagement. How are you in each one of these aspects? And then we didn't even have to dedicate the whole session to it, because we had the debriefing and we dedicate, but it was more, then there was the continuation of, okay, which one do you feel next week you need to retake or rework on? And it gave that on the side that we could work well-being while also touching confidence or other things that are key components in the process of returning to work.
You heard from Jen Kidby earlier when she mentioned that language was the thing that stood out for her from her series. As we wrap up this episode now, I invited each of our hosts to share with you anything else that we hadn't had chance to touch upon in our conversation so far.
Where that question takes me is something about how we need to, how I know I do, and this podcast series is strongly pushing me in that direction, to how we need to update, refresh, reimagine, evolve our own coaching practice. Doing this series is really going to make me think hard about who I am as a coach, why I work in the way that I do or have done so far, what is waiting to evolve, what wants to emerge in my coaching practice that is being called out by the issues that people bring, which, as we talk about in the podcast, it is much less kind of performative these days. So I think it's inviting me to really think hard about what ways of coaching I might want to let go of in order to create space for what wants to emerge in my practice. Something like that.
I'd like to say, let's have another series, because I know there are so many other schemes out there. Yeah, I'd love the idea to potentially expand this further, because I still think that there are so many interesting applications that could inspire others. I'm not committing to do that right now. I think my final words would be, if someone's listening to this and they are involved in a scheme where they're using coaching in an unusual and innovative way with a client group who may not always either have access to coaching or be heard, then, it would be great to somehow share their experience, and also then to potentially inspire other coaches to get involved and to lend their skills. So yeah, in whatever way, hopefully some of those schemes can be better known. And who knows, maybe, it was lovely to have your support, Rob, and obviously Maxine as well, to create these podcasts. So I think if the AC would consider supporting another lot in the future, then maybe that's something I'd be interested in doing.
I was surprised in some ways that there's so much yet to be done to support neuro-inclusion in the workplace, and people's understanding of how to effectively help people feel like they belong in the workplace, because there's so much psychological, I'm going to say damage or psychological difficulty that's being caused by not necessarily the employers that people are with now, but people from the past. And it's still a taboo subject that comes into my coaching practice on a regular basis. And it's sad that I have to help people really through being in psychologically unsafe environments to begin to trust themselves and trust people around them. I think there is still a huge room for improvement in organisational understanding about how they create psychologically safe spaces for neurodivergent people.
A huge thank you to everybody who was a part of making it happen, really. Without authors who put their trust in me and willing to put their reputation out there in the world as part of a podcast series, to yourself and Maxine and everybody at the AC who collaborated across multiple time zones and multiple objectives. I have a huge sense of gratitude in what happens when a group of people come together from disparate places and they want to make something happen that can do some good in the world. So thank you to everybody.
It's specific on the topic on somebody else's podcast. And I guess this was Julie Flowers' Coaching for Good, Punching Through Grief with Claire Henry. And we are at a time, of course, where AI is such a big topic. And we're doing with AC the coffee chats for AI, where we are trying to understand coaches, the coaching journey and everything that goes, the ethics in AI and the mindset to have with AI and what the companies are doing. But in a world where all this is happening, it was also nice to see this episode where they integrate something that AI couldn't do. So they integrated this physical activity with also coaching in a way that only humans could do. So it was nice to see coaching used in such a creative way, also so specialized, to also get this way in which we can integrate coaching with different things and be creative about it and make it more human. So that series, I really recommend the episode, as I do with most of the ones I hear from you. But it was a nice one to hear how it's so unique and so creative and so successful in the way they are implementing it.
It was a nice surprise for me when putting this Reflections episode together for you to hear one of the hosts referring to another host's series. In this instance, hearing Claudia referring to episode 241, where Julie was the host of the series of Coaching for Good, and the episode was Punching Through Grief, a revolutionary coaching approach to healing, which you can find on the associationforcoaching.com and if you head to the Digital Learning Hub. Just before we close, I've got a couple more final thoughts to share with you, the listener. Firstly, from Helen about supervision. Maxine and I noticed that after some 200 episodes, there was a very strong theme and a lot of talk of supervision. So it's been great this year to actually bring the topic of supervision front and centre. Maybe as a result of our podcast series, it's increased my own awareness. One thing I've noticed since putting out that series on supervision is the number of people interested in getting coaching supervision.
It's a joyous thing to offer. So if you're thinking about training as a coach supervisor, I would really encourage that. If you're a coach and you care about yourself and your clients, I would really encourage you to find a way to access coaching supervision, and that there is so much more to say. So maybe there'll be another series or another way of talking about it.
And if you're a coach or a member of the Association for Coaching and you like what you've heard today, and maybe the hosts that you've heard from today have inspired you to come to us with an idea for a podcast series, we'd love to hear from you. You can email me at rob@associationforcoaching.com or our digital learning team at digitallearning@associationforcoaching.com. Kate Jenkinson was kind enough to share a little bit of encouragement with me when I spoke with her for you if you're interested in becoming a host.
Just do it. I mean, it's just, for many of us, that sort of excitement can feel like fear and it might stop you. But it really has been such a thrill and a joy to have the conversations and to think, hopefully, we can revisit this topic maybe in a year and 2 years' time and find that there has been movement and that there is greater understanding and that people are finding acceptance and belonging in the workplace, and being able to advocate for their needs, and people go, yes, we understand, and those needs to be met. And I would love somebody who has a passion like mine or their own to sort of feel like they've explored it fully and had a chance to have some fantastic conversations about it.
So there you have it. These have been our reflections on the podcast series for 2025 from the Association for Coaching. I want to thank each of our hosts and my guests today: Julie Flower, Kate Jenkinson, Helena Clayton, Claudia Day, Helen O'Grady, and Jen Kidby. I also want to thank Smiranda Dokia, Director of the Digital Learning Team, and Maxine Bell, our podcast manager, for all of their help and support this year, putting each and every one of these episodes together every week for you. I want to add my special thanks to Maxine for all her help and support organising not only this Reflections episode, which we've had to record virtually across time and space, but every single episode for each one of the 6 series we've produced in 2025. I also want to thank you, the listener, for being here right now and for all of the episodes that you've been listening to this year. We'd love to hear from you. So did you spot my overarching theme? Email me at rob@associationforcoaching.com. And thanks for listening, and look out for more new exciting digital learning topics, not just on the podcast next year in 2026, but on the Digital Learning Hub, which you can find at www.associationforcoaching.com. Thank you for listening to another podcast by the Association for Coaching. For over 20 years, our purpose has been to inspire and champion coaching excellence, advance the coaching profession and make a sustainable difference to individuals, organisations and society. To find out more about the AC and our member benefits, follow us on LinkedIn or visit our webpage at associationforcoaching.com. Explore our Digital Learning Hub and enjoy our extensive library of on-demand webinars, interviews, podcasts and a portfolio of live events featuring thought leadership, tools, models and the latest industry trends to help you develop your coaching expertise.